I think the markets are still delusional with respect to inflation. I think most analysts still expect that what we're seeing is transitory. They just think the transition is taking longer than they first thought. They still think the inflation is driven by supply chain bottlenecks or the war with Russia and Ukraine. And so they think that all this stuff is going to unclog and prices are going to magically stop rising. But that's not going to happen. I mean, the inflation is being caused by the government, by the Federal Reserve. And I see the budget deficits and the trade deficits getting bigger and bigger. And so the Federal Reserve is going to continue to create more inflation. And even though the Fed has raised interest rates, they're still at 0.25%. Inflation, even if you buy the government's version of inflation, that is 8%, how are you going to put out 8% inflation fire with a squirt gun of 0.25% interest rate? I mean, that's never worked. Interest rates are historically negative. I mean, Paul Volcker in 1980, to finally get rid of inflation, rates went to 20%. The highest inflation got in 1980 was 13.5%. So he had 6.5% real rates to bend the inflation curve. How are we going to bend that curve when we have negative 7.5% interest rates? There is no incentive to change your spending and borrowing and consumption patterns with a negative 7.5% rate. It's not like people are going to be incentivized to start saving now because they want to earn that negative 7.5%. Of course not. People aren't going to stop borrowing even though they're getting paid 7.5% to borrow. A negative interest rate means you're being paid to go out and take out a loan. So people are going to keep doing that. Nothing is going to change. Inflation is going to keep getting worse. The Fed is actually pursuing an inflationary monetary policy under the guise of fighting inflation. You know, just because you're less loose than you were before doesn't mean you're tight. And of course, you're not even less loose because inflation is accelerating faster than the Fed is hiking rates. So rates in real terms are actually lower today than they were many, many months ago when the Fed first started contemplating the first quarter-point rate hike.
All right, so let's talk about Fed's policy. What can they do to fight inflation, assuming they even are interested in really fighting inflation? You've tweeted this, and I'm just going to read one of your tweets from yesterday. You said, Powell admitted price stability is so important to the long-term health of the labor market that the Fed may have to keep hiking interest rates to bring inflation down, even if unemployment rises. The same would apply to asset prices falling. This resolve will soon be tested. All right, what do you mean by that? Are you saying that it's either or, either the labor market or inflation? We can't have both?
Well, the economy that we have today, and I call it a bubble, it's a phony economy, it is completely dependent on artificially low interest rates, on all this credit-financed consumption and wealth that comes from inflated asset prices. So we've got this drugged up economy and we need to remove the drug. Well, you can't do that without collapsing the economy. It's like, you know, if you're high on drugs, is there any way that you could kick the habit and stay high? No. I mean, you stop taking the drugs, you're not going to be high anymore. You're going to go through withdrawal. So yes, the Fed can fight inflation if it wants to, but if it fights inflation, it's going to have to collapse this bubble economy that was built on its cheap money, because you can't fight inflation with cheap money. You got to take the cheap money away. And interest rates have to rise dramatically, not just a little bit. They have to go way up. And the government has to really start shrinking the money supply, or the Federal Reserve. They have to start reversing quantitative easing. They can't just slowly allow their balance sheet to run down. And by the way, look at their latest numbers. The week just ended on Wednesday. The Fed added another $45 billion to the balance sheet. It set a new record high. They continue to monetize government debt. You can't do that if you want to fight inflation. That is creating additional inflation. So the only way that the Fed can truly fight inflation is to allow a massive recession, a complete collapse of this phony economy. And it's going to force the U.S. government to make some hard fiscal decisions that it's never made, because it's not going to be able to finance its deficits if the Fed is fighting inflation. So we're going to either have to have massive cuts in government spending, including entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. We're going to have massive increases in taxes on the middle class, not on the rich, on the middle class, working Americans, or some combination of that. Or the government might have to default on its treasury obligations. These are the things that the government's going to have to consider if the Fed were to actually fight inflation, which is why I don't believe the Fed. I don't think the Fed's going to fight inflation. In fact, if they were going to fight it, they would have already done it. We wouldn't still be at 25 basis points in interest rates. They wouldn't have finally raised interest rates on Wednesday if they were committed to fighting inflation. They would have done it a long time ago. They wouldn't have continued quantitative easing when it was obvious that we had an inflation problem. I mean, even after they admitted that they got it wrong and inflation was not transitory, they kept printing money. They kept monetizing debt. They kept interest rates at zero. So I don't care what the Fed says. I look at what the Fed does, and their actions speak a lot louder than their words.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information. And it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
Do you want to know one thing about crypto? I made over 3000% in profit in a few weeks. Fact is, the traditional financial system, the traditional money system makes you poor, not rich. If you want to earn $500,000, $1 million, you have to wait until you're 50, 60, 70 in the traditional financial system, and you probably will still be broke. And you will be old. This is not a sexy combination, as you can imagine. But the question is, how can you start in crypto and make these profits? Where to invest? Where to start? My name is Gunnar and I'm from Germany, as you can hear, and things are a little bit different in Germany. More about that later on. Fact is, there are lots of different cryptocurrencies. It's a gigantic universe where beginners and professionals get easily lost. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. There are 7 key steps you need to follow to become successful in this market. You have to know them, and if you fail one of them, it's literally impossible to succeed in this market. Just an example, one of the key points is your exchange, and one of the biggest are, for example, Binance and Coinbase. These are trusted and well-established exchanges, but, and this is a big but, you won't find the super profitable coins on those exchanges. The unknown super profitable coins that get gigantic profits are not traded on those kind of exchanges. They are traded on much smaller insider platforms that are barely known. And I can tell you what those super secret exchanges are and why they are so profitable. And another super important thing are the right information sources. The point is, the internet is gigantic. There are hundreds and hundreds of YouTube channels, blogs, pages, and much more. And there are also market makers and influencers. For example, Elon Musk, he is not a crypto guy, but the moment he recommended Dogecoin, it went through the roof, to the moon, so to say. But why did he recommend it? Where did he hear it from? He didn't hear it from newspapers. And believe me, he is listening to someone. But you have to know who, and you have to react before he is reacting. This is really, really important. And these are only 2 of the 7 steps you have to follow in order to be successful in crypto. And if you want to know all of these steps in much more detail, and if you want to have a comprehensive checklist, here's what you should do. There is a link below this video. Click on this link and you will get the opportunity to subscribe to my channel. Click on the link and you will see a video where I explain the next steps. So see you soon. Click on the link now. I'll see you there.